Have you ever wondered what it would take to erase the person you were raised to be? What kind of courage it requires not just to leave a world of darkness, but to turn back and become the very force that dismantles it? Today's story is about a girl born into the royalty of the criminal underworld, a princess in a gilded cage. But this is not a fairy tale. It's the story of her escape, her transformation, and the final devastating act of justice she would one day deliver to the very family she once loved. If you believe that our past does not have to define our future, and that the brightest light is often forged in the deepest shadows, then join our community. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and let's explore the impossible journey of a woman who chose not to be a queen of crime, but a servant of justice. Leela was not raised in the squalor of street crime, but in the quiet, opulent grandeur of a kingdom. Her father, Marcus, did not see himself as a criminal. He saw himself as a king. His empire was built on fear and shadow, but within the high walls of their secluded estate, he ruled with the calm, strategic mind of a grandmaster. His greatest lesson to Leela was not taught with threats, but over a chessboard. "Every piece on this board has a purpose, my little lioness," he would say, his voice a low, charismatic rumble. "The king is the most important, but he is nothing without his queen, his bishops, his knights. We are a family, Leela, and family protects the king." His lessons were about power, about loyalty, about seeing the world not as a place of rules, but as a series of calculated moves. He loved her with a fierce, possessive pride. He saw in her his own sharp intellect, his own unyielding will. He showered her with every material thing a child could desire: rare books, expensive toys, tailored dresses. But his love was a form of architecture, carefully constructing the walls of a beautiful prison. He was not raising a daughter, he was training a successor. He was preparing her to one day inherit his throne of shadows, to navigate the complex web of alliances and betrayals he called business. He taught her to be strong, to be ruthless, to trust no one outside their circle. He taught her everything she needed to know to survive in his world, never once considering that she might one day want to live in another. Lila's childhood was a paradox of luxury and confinement. The sprawling estate was her entire world, a place of pristine gardens, silent servants, and long, echoing hallways hung with priceless art. But the high stone walls and wrought iron gates were not there to keep intruders out. They were there to keep her in. Her family was not made up of aunts and cousins, but of Marcus's most trusted lieutenants, hard-faced men with quiet voices and eyes that missed nothing. They were her uncles, men who treated her with a strange, unnerving mixture of paternal affection and profound fear. They would bring her gifts from faraway places, but their hands were stained with a darkness she could feel but not yet name. She was the princess of this strange, silent court. She was respected, protected, and utterly alone. She had tutors for every subject, but no friends her own age. Her world was a carefully curated illusion, a stage play where everyone played their part with flawless precision. Dinner conversations were not about school or friends. They were about shipments, territories, and disputes that were settled in the dead of night. Violence was a ghost that haunted the edges of her life, a concept sanitized by euphemisms like negotiations and solving problems. She was raised in the heart of a criminal enterprise, but was taught to see it as a family business, a kingdom that operated by its own, more honorable code. The perfect gilded facade of Leela's world cracked on a cold autumn evening when she was 16. She was in the estate's library, a magnificent 2-story room that was her only true sanctuary, when she heard the sound of a car arriving unexpectedly. Peeking through the heavy velvet curtains, she saw her father and 2 of his uncles dragging a man from the trunk of a car. He was not a rival gangster. He was a shopkeeper from town, a gentle, kind-faced man who had always given her a free piece of candy when her father had, on rare occasions, taken her into the city. He was bleeding, pleading, his words lost in the wind. She watched in frozen horror as they took him into one of the soundproofed outbuildings. Later that night, her father came to her in the library. He was calm, his suit immaculate, not a speck of dust on his polished shoes. He explained that the shopkeeper had broken a promise, that he had been a threat to the family. He used the same calm, rational tone he used to explain a move in chess. But for the first time, his logic was a grotesque distortion of the truth. Leela had seen the man's terror. This was not a strategic move on a board. It was the brutalization of an innocent. She looked at her father, the king she had adored her entire life, and for the first time, she saw the monster beneath the crown. The gilded bars of her cage suddenly felt cold and sharp. The foundation of her world had fractured, and through the crack a horrifying, undeniable truth was beginning to shine through. The crack in Leela's world grew into a chasm. The gilded cage, once a symbol of her father's protection, now felt like a tomb. Every smile from her uncles, every calm, strategic lesson from Marcus was now tainted by the memory of the shopkeeper's terrified face. The love she had for her father curdled into a complex mixture of fear and a profound, aching disappointment. She knew she could not stay. To remain would be to condone, to become complicit, to eventually become the queen of a kingdom built on pain. Her escape could not be an emotional outburst. That would be a fatal mistake. She had to use the very skills her father had taught her: strategy, patience, and a quiet ruthlessness against him. For a year, she played the part of the devoted daughter, the perfect princess. But in the secret, silent hours of the night, she was a meticulous architect of her own liberation. She learned the estate's security schedules, the blind spots in the camera systems, the patterns of the guards who patrolled the walls. She used her access to the syndicate's financial records, a privilege granted to her as the heir, to siphon off small, untraceable amounts of cash, creating a secret fund for her new life. She studied maps, memorized bus schedules, and researched cities where a nameless girl could disappear. She forged a new identity, a new name, a new history, using the very underworld connections she was planning to flee. It was the ultimate chess match, a game played for the highest stakes, her own soul. The night she chose to leave was moonless and starless, a thick blanket of darkness that offered the perfect cover. She had everything prepared: a single bag with her new identity, the cash, and nothing else from her old life. But as she was about to slip out, a single lamp turned on in the grand foyer. Marcus was there, sitting in his large armchair, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He was not surprised. He had been waiting. The king had sensed the betrayal in his court. The silence between them was heavy with the weight of unspoken words, of a love that was now a wound. "So," he said, his voice a low, gravelly sound of disappointment, "the little lioness thinks she can survive in the jungle." It was not a tender farewell. It was a confrontation, a final brutal lesson. He did not try to stop her physically. He tried to break her spirit. "That world out there," he hissed, his charisma replaced by a cold, sharp-edged menace. "It's not like our world, Leela. It's filled with weakness, with chaos. It will chew you up and spit you out. You are one of us. You think you can wash our blood from your veins?" He stood and walked toward her, his presence immense. He tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture that was both paternal and threatening. "Go then," he whispered, "but remember this: wherever you go, whatever you become, you will always be my daughter, and that is a truth you can never escape." He turned and walked away, leaving the door open for her, a final, arrogant display of his belief that she would fail, that she would come crawling back to the only world that would ever truly accept her. Leela walked out of that open door and did not look back. Every step away from the estate was a physical, tearing pain, like shedding a skin she had worn her entire life. She was leaving behind not just a place, but an identity. The love of her father, the only love she had ever known, was now a poison she had to purge. She took a series of buses, traveling for 2 days, moving across the country like a ghost, her face hidden under a hooded sweatshirt. In a grimy bus station restroom in a city whose name she didn't know, she looked at her reflection for the last time. The girl with the haunted, privileged eyes was a stranger. She took a pair of scissors from her bag and, with trembling, decisive cuts, she sheared off her long hair, the dark locks falling into the dirty sink like shed memories. She took out the fake ID she had created with a new name, a simple, anonymous name that had no history, no weight. Lila Thorne, the princess of the Underworld, died in that restroom. The girl who walked out was someone else, a blank page, a ghost determined to build a new life from the ashes of the old one. But as she stepped out into the harsh, indifferent light of the new city, her father's final words echoed in her mind, not as a memory, but as a curse she would have to spend the rest of her life trying to break. The world her father had warned her about was every bit as harsh and unforgiving as he had predicted, but not in the ways he imagined. Lila, now living under a new anonymous name, discovered a different kind of brutality, the quiet, grinding cruelty of poverty. The money she had stolen, which had seemed like a fortune, dwindled with alarming speed. She rented a small, bleak room in a rundown part of a city where no one knew her name. The silence she had craved was now a suffocating loneliness. For the first time in her life, she was truly invisible, no longer a princess, but just another face in the anonymous, struggling crowd. Her past life had prepared her for strategic warfare, not for the daily, humbling battle for survival. She took on jobs that were a world away from her privileged upbringing. She washed dishes in the greasy kitchen of a 24-hour diner, the smell of bleach and old food clinging to her clothes. She stocked shelves in the dead of night at a grocery store, her body aching with the physical exhaustion she had never known. Each day was a lesson in humility. But the same discipline and relentless focus her father had instilled in her for a life of crime, she now channeled into her own survival. She saved every spare dollar, her goal a distant, seemingly impossible dream, an education. She would spend her nights not sleeping, but studying in her small, cramped room, the glow of a cheap desk lamp her only companion. The world was trying to break her, but it did not know that she had been forged in a fire far hotter than this. She was building a new life, not from the ashes of her old one, but from the hard, unforgiving bedrock of the real world. Her choice to pursue a career in law was not a sudden inspiration. It was a deep, instinctual calling. It was the answer to a question that had haunted her since the night she saw the shopkeeper's terrified face. One evening, after a grueling shift at the diner, she found herself taking refuge from the rain in the lobby of the city's old courthouse. She watched the people coming and going, the anxious families, the determined lawyers, the stoic judges. She saw the intricate, formal dance of the legal system, and in its rigid, complex structure, she saw not a limitation, but a promise. Her father's world operated on a code of personal power, of loyalty that could be bought and sold, of a justice that was arbitrary and cruel. The law, she realized, was meant to be the opposite. It was a system, a set of rules designed to be impersonal, to shield the weak from the strong, to create order out of the chaos of human nature. It was an attempt, however flawed, to build a fortress for the innocent, the very people her father and his family had preyed upon. For Lila, the law became more than a career path. It became a form of purification. It was a way to take the analytical, strategic mind her father had given her and repurpose it, to turn a weapon designed for darkness into an instrument of light. Justice became her new creed, the study of statutes and precedents her new form of prayer. She was not just seeking a profession, She was seeking a way to build a firewall between who she was and what she had come from. Her new life was a carefully constructed fortress, but she knew it was built on a foundation of lies. The fear of being discovered was a constant, low-level hum beneath the surface of her daily life. The past was a shadow that stretched across the country, a ghost she could never entirely outrun. Every time a black luxury car similar to her father's drove by, her heart would seize for a moment. A news report about organized crime in her old city would send a jolt of cold dread through her. Once, in a crowded university library, she saw a man with a familiar tattoo on his wrist, the same kind worn by one of her father's enforcers. She fled the building, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and didn't return for a week. She built walls within walls, keeping everyone at a distance. She had no close friends, no romantic relationships. To let someone in would be to risk exposing the secret that was both her shield and her prison. She was a ghost, haunted by the life she had abandoned. Her father's final words echoed in her loneliest moments, "You will always be my daughter." The phrase was a constant, terrifying reminder that her transformation was a fragile one. She was not just running from her father's men. She was running from the part of herself that was still his creation, the part that understood his darkness because it had once been her own. Years of relentless, single-minded dedication paid off. Leela, under her new name, did not just succeed, she excelled. She graduated from law school at the top of her class, her name synonymous with a brilliant, incisive legal mind. She became a prosecutor, earning a reputation as a fierce, incorruptible force in the courtroom. She was known for her meticulous preparation, her uncanny ability to dismantle complex criminal enterprises, and her unyielding, almost severe, commitment to the letter of the law. There was a cold, detached precision to her work that made some colleagues uneasy, but none could argue with her results. She was a rising star, a woman who seemed to have appeared from nowhere, with no past, no family, and a work ethic that was nothing short of superhuman. Her eventual appointment as a judge was seen as the logical, inevitable next step. When she first put on the black robe, the heavy fabric felt like a suit of armor she had been fighting for her entire life. In the solemn, wood-paneled courtroom, she found a new kind of sanctuary. It was a place of absolute order, of rules and reason, a fortress far more secure than her father's walled estate. On the bench, she was no longer the frightened girl running from her past. She was the embodiment of the system she had chosen to serve, an arbiter of justice, a symbol of the very power that stood in opposition to the world of chaos she had escaped. Her reputation grew. She was known as Judge Sterling, fair, formidable, and famously unflinching. She had finally built a life so solid, a reputation so strong, that she began to believe the ghost of her past had finally been laid to rest. The case file landed on her desk on a Tuesday morning. It was thick, bound in red tape, and marked as high profile. A major organized crime syndicate, one that had operated with impunity for decades, had finally been brought down by a sweeping federal investigation. It was the kind of case that defined a judge's career, a complex, multi-defendant trial that would be watched by the entire nation. As she opened the file, her professional focus was sharp. She began to read through the indictment, her eyes scanning the complex web of racketeering, extortion, and conspiracy charges. And then she saw the names of the defendants. The air in her chambers seemed to turn to ice. Her breath caught in her throat. The names on the page were not anonymous criminals. They were the names of her uncles, the men who had taught her how to ride a bike, who had brought her gifts from their business trips, whose faces were an inseparable part of the tapestry of her childhood. And then, at the very bottom of the list, designated as the head of the enterprise, was the name of the man who had orchestrated it all, Marcus Thorne, her father. The past had not been laid to rest. It had been waiting. And now it had walked into her courtroom and was staring her in the face. Her world, so carefully constructed, tilted on its axis. Her first instinct was a primal, gut-wrenching urge to flee. the same instinct that had saved her all those years ago. The rules were clear. She had an undeniable conflict of interest. She had a moral and legal obligation to recuse herself from the case, to pass it on to another judge and disappear before her secret was exposed. To preside over this trial would be to risk everything: her career, her new identity, her very freedom. The risk of exposure was enormous. The defense would dig into her past. They would find the girl she used to be and use it to destroy the woman she had become. She spent a sleepless night pacing her apartment, the silence of her life now a roaring cacophony of doubt and fear. But as the first gray light of dawn broke over the city, a new, steely resolve began to form. To run now would be the ultimate act of cowardice. It would be an admission that she was still the frightened girl, still defined by her father's shadow. Her father had built his empire by knowing his enemies, by understanding their weaknesses from the inside. And who knew this empire better than she did? Who understood its twisted code of loyalty, its hidden structures, its secret language? She realized with a chilling clarity that this was not a conflict of interest. It was her destiny. It was the final, terrifying chapter of the story she had started the night she walked out of his open door. She would not run. She would put on her robe, walk into that courtroom, and she would preside over the trial that would either be her ultimate redemption or her complete and utter ruin. The first day of the trial was a masterclass in controlled composure. As Judge Sterling, she walked into the packed courtroom, her face an unreadable mask of judicial impartiality. But as she took her seat on the bench, looking down at the defendant's table, her heart hammered against her ribs. It was like looking at a gallery of ghosts from a life she had tried to bury. There was Sal, the man who had taught her how to skip stones across the estate's private lake, his face now a bloated, jowly sneer. There was Frankie, who had always brought her back a small carved animal from his travels, his eyes now cold and filled with a murderous contempt. One by one, she saw them, the men who had been the pillars of her strange, isolated childhood, now reduced to a row of sullen, defiant criminals in ill-fitting suits. Their reaction to seeing her on the bench was a silent, theatrical explosion. A wave of shock, followed by a dark, simmering rage, rippled through the defendants. They exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and a dawning, venomous understanding. They saw her not as a judge, but as a traitor, the ultimate apostate to their creed of family loyalty. Lila could feel the weight of their hatred, a palpable force in the room, but she met their glares with the same cool, detached authority she presented to every defendant who entered her court. She was no longer Lila, the frightened princess. She was Judge Sterling, and in this room, she was the one who held the power. The trial began, her voice steady and clear as she laid out the procedures, each word a carefully placed stone in the new wall she was building between her past and her present. As the trial unfolded over weeks, it became a tense, psychological chess match. The defense team, hired by her father, was formidable, and they had a secret weapon, her. They couldn't expose her directly without implicating their own clients in a potential cover-up, but they danced dangerously close to the edge. They made subtle, coded references to family betrayals, to insiders with a grudge. During the cross-examination of a key witness, a former associate of the gang, the lead defense attorney asked a loaded question. Isn't it true that Marcus Thorne had a daughter whom he loved dearly, a daughter who disappeared under mysterious circumstances? The question hung in the air, a direct, personal attack disguised as a legal inquiry, designed to unnerve her, to make her react emotionally. The entire courtroom held its breath, all eyes on the judge. But Leela had prepared for this. She had spent a lifetime studying her father's strategies, and she recognized this move for what it was: an attempt to shift the focus, to turn the trial from a matter of law into a personal drama. She did not flinch. Her expression remained one of cold, professional neutrality. "Counselor," she said, her voice cutting through the tension, "the court is not interested in rumor or family gossip. Confine your questions to the charges in the indictment, or I will hold you in contempt." Her response was a masterful display of control. But she did more than just deflect their attacks. She used her intimate knowledge of the syndicate against them. She understood the nuances of their coded language, the hidden meanings in their financial records, the subtle fault lines in their wall of loyalty. She could see the lies in their testimony because she had been raised among them. The very past they were trying to use as a weapon against her, she was now wielding as a scalpel, dissecting their criminal enterprise with a surgical, devastating precision. The day of the verdict arrived with a heavy, electric stillness. The jury filed in, their faces grim and set. One by one, the foreman read the verdicts for each of the defendants, for each of the dozens of charges. Guilty, guilty, guilty. The word echoed through the courtroom, a drumbeat of finality. Her uncles, the men who had once seemed like invincible giants, now looked small and defeated, their bluster collapsing into the pale, slack-jawed shock of men who had been thoroughly outplayed. It fell to Leela to pronounce the sentences. She addressed each man by name, looking them directly in the eye. As she spoke, she was not just a judge reading a legal decision. She was a daughter closing a chapter of her life. For Sal, the man who had taught her to skip stones, she sentenced him to 20 years for extortion, the weight of each year a stone sinking into the dark water of their shared past. For Frankie, who had brought her trinkets from around the world, she sentenced him to life for a murder committed in the service of the syndicate, the sentence a final, brutal souvenir. Her voice was steady, unwavering, devoid of triumph or malice. It was the voice of pure, unadulterated justice. Each sentence she delivered was a deliberate, painful, and necessary act of liberation. It was the sound of chains breaking, of a gilded cage being dismantled, piece by piece, until she was finally, blessedly, standing in the ruins, free. The main trial was over, the syndicate's infrastructure shattered, its lieutenants sentenced. But one final piece remained on the board: the king. Marcus Thorne had waived his right to a jury trial, opting instead to be judged by the court alone. By her. The day he was brought into the courtroom, the atmosphere was different. It was not the charged, chaotic energy of the gang trial. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, thick with the weight of a lifetime of unspoken history. He walked in, not with the defeated slump of the other defendants, but with an unnerving, regal calm. He was older, grayer, but the aura of absolute power was still there. He wore a perfectly tailored prison jumpsuit, as if it were a bespoke suit. His eyes, the same sharp, intelligent eyes she had inherited, found hers across the courtroom. As he stood before her bench, the world seemed to shrink until only the two of them existed. It was the most profound and terrifying moment of Leela's life. He was not just a defendant, he was her father, the architect of her entire existence, the source of both her deepest wounds and her greatest strengths. The man who had taught her to read, who had named the constellations for her, who had loved her with a fierce, possessive fire. And he was the monster she had run from, the ghost that had haunted her for over a decade. In that long, silent gaze, an entire lifetime passed between them, a chess game on a rainy afternoon, the smell of his pipe tobacco in the library, the cold, final words at the gate, the shared blood that was both a bond and a curse. She was his daughter, and she was his judge. And in that moment, the two identities were at war within her soul. The prosecutor began to lay out the case against Marcus, a mountain of evidence detailing his reign as the head of the criminal empire. But before he could get far, Marcus's defense attorney stood. "Your Honor," the lawyer said, "my client wishes to address the court." A hush fell over the room. Marcus rose slowly to his feet, his gaze never leaving Leela's. He did not speak to the court, to the prosecutor, or to his own lawyer. He spoke only to her. "There is no need for this," he said, his voice the same calm, resonant rumble she remembered from childhood. "The evidence is correct. The charges are true." And then, in a move that stunned the entire courtroom, he said the two words that would seal his fate: "I'm guilty." He did not say them with remorse or regret. He said them with a strange, unnerving finality. He had not been outplayed or defeated by the legal system. In his mind, he was conceding the game to the only player he had ever considered his equal. He looked at his daughter, the woman of steel sitting on the bench, the formidable judge who had systematically dismantled his entire world. And a faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. It was a look of dark, twisted pride. It was as if he was saying, "Look what I created. Look at the lioness I raised. She is strong enough even to destroy me." His plea was not an act of surrender. It was his final, perverse acknowledgement of her victory, his last and most profound lesson in power. Now there was only the sentencing. The room was so quiet that Leela could hear the frantic beating of her own heart. This was the moment that had defined her entire life, the final act of her long, painful journey of self-creation. The law provided guidelines, but the final decision was hers. She could have been vengeful, sentencing him to the harshest possible punishment, a brutal final severing of their bond. She could have recused herself at the last second, unable to bear the weight of the moment. But she did neither. She took a deep, steadying breath, and when she spoke, her voice was not the voice of a cold, implacable judge, nor the voice of a broken, grieving daughter. It was her own voice, found at last. She spoke of the law, of the lives his empire had destroyed, of the debt he owed to a society whose rules he had so arrogantly disregarded. Her words were just, they were fair, they were rooted in the principles she had dedicated her life to upholding. And then, for a single fleeting moment, she allowed herself to be his daughter. "The law demands justice," she said, her voice softening, cracking with an emotion she could no longer contain. "And a daughter deserved a father." She sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the bailiffs led him away, Marcus looked back at her one last time, his expression unreadable. Leela did not watch him go. She lowered her gaze to the gavel on her bench. She picked it up, the smooth, heavy wood cool in her hand, and brought it down with a single, sharp, definitive crack. It was not a sound of triumph. It was the sound of a chain finally breaking. The sound of a story, her story, finally being free.